So thank you for coming tonight. You're all very welcome. This has become particularly topical in light of the Synod. Now, it was time to be after the Synod, but the Synod became such a big story and such a controversial story that it's become doubly topical. And in fact, because the Synod has received so much coverage and so many interpretations, that we're actually going to reverse the running order here. And Father Vincent Twomey is going to speak first, and then I'll respond to him and give a few subsequent thoughts. So we're going to give Father Twomey the lion's share, so a theologian of his standing can put a bit of shape, hopefully, on the Synod for the rest of us. Dr. John Murray is going to chair proceedings. Dr. Murray is, of course, chairman of the board of the Iona Institute, a lecturer in moral theology at Mater Dei Institute, and a former student of Father Vincent Twomey. So, John.
Thank you, David. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to what I'm sure is going to be a fascinating, informative, entertaining and thought-provoking evening. You have before you at the table there two of the sharpest minds in Ireland, if not Europe or the world. Now, of course, whether having a sharp mind is a good thing, or whether you're better off with a warm heart, or whether in fact the two can coexist in the same people, is part of what we are here to talk about. So I'm looking forward to hearing what our two speakers have to say. Now, Father Vincent Twomey is well known to me because I'm a lecturer in Mater Dei, as David just said there, and I did my doctorate in theology there back a few years ago, and I had the great good fortune, the great blessing of having Vincent Twomey as my supervisor. So he very, very assiduously went through lots of written work that I handed him, many, many pages, way beyond the allotted amount, I have to say, but did it all very patiently and survived, which is great. And he's been very busy. He didn't realise, of course, when I began in 2002 that in 2005 he'd be getting even busier when his doctoral supervisor managed to take the limelight and be elected as Pope. So I'm not sure if that's going to happen to me, but you never know. It's never too late yet. But for tonight, anyway, we have him as the emeritus professor of moral theology from Maynooth. And so I'd like you to give a warm welcome to Father Vincent Twomey.
So good evening, everybody. It's good to be here, and it's wonderful to see so many people coming. I think it indicates, actually, to a certain extent, the impact the Synod has already had, and that is quite exciting. I think this is a wonderfully exciting time to be in the Church. Just to begin with, I'd like to just quote from an article that appeared in the English Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph, I presume, which a friend sent to me, and I thought it was well done. You can't beat the Brits at times, or the English, when to approach the thing in a light way. Yeah? Begins, calm down, dears, it's only a synod. This huge kind of excitement, yeah? And a lot of people anxious about, people who feel the Church is going to change everything, yeah? To be precise, he says, the Catholic Synod on the families that everyone is talking about is actually a preliminary synod. They called it, unfortunately, with a Latin phrase, extraordinary synod. Yeah? It means not the ordinary, but it turned out to be extraordinary in many senses. It's preliminary to the synod that's going to be held next year, and nothing coming out of it is supposed to be definitive or official. That's not to say, at least, that it hasn't been a grotesque PR disaster for the Church that risks injecting the poison of politics into Catholicism. Although some might argue that things have been quietly venomous for some time. And that, I think, is true. And I think that is at the root of many of our problems today, the venom on both sides. The original topic for today was tonight's lecture was standards and mercy. And in a sense, it sums up the two sides as seen in the grotesque way that the media tends to portray it, not only the secular media, but also the Catholic media. You have standards, people who are upholding standards with rigorism and harshness, and mercy, the compassionate, and people who others would consider laxist and soft. Things, of course, are much more complex than that. Now, if I were to give a topic, I was wondering what kind of title I would give to this talk today, and I think the first title I chose actually was In Praise of Pope Francis. Then I thought, well, of course, in praise of, there's a famous book by Erasmus called In Praise of Folly. That perhaps might be actually appropriate. The folly is a play on the word Moore. Thomas More, it was for Thomas More. But I chose A Tale of Two Synods. And there's more to that than meets the eye. So last Saturday, as you know, the Synod closed with the voting on the final report. This was after the hullabaloo caused by the interim report, to which I also responded with the article that appeared eventually last Saturday in the Irish Times. So it ended with this final report, which was the summary of the discussions in the small language groups that went on to discuss the interim report. And what they produced was described even by Cardinal Burke as being totally in harmony, if not in complete account of what actually was discussed at the Synod. And one of the first things, of course, that we have learned, and the Church has been very slow to learn it, we live in an age of transparency. Nothing can be hidden and shouldn't be hidden. The early councils of the Church, the early synods, were open. There was no media there, and that's very significant, but nonetheless, everyone knew what and who said, what was said and who said it. Because in the Church, if you believe something, you should be able to stand up and be counted, not work behind any kind of bench, even an episcopal bench. Anyhow, so the Synod closed last Saturday with the final report, which, by the way, will now be the basis for the rest of the process, culminating in a year's time with the actual ordinary Synod. Then you had, as well, last Saturday, the address of Pope Francis to the Synod. Now, during the Synod, he remained silent. Archbishop Martin confirmed that in his radio interview this morning, Morning Ireland, I think, when he said that despite calls by people, would you please say something? He said nothing. The silence of Pope Francis. And I think that was magnificent. Why? I'll tell you in a moment, I hope. When he did speak, he gave a magnificent address and got a 4-minute standing ovation from all the bishops and cardinals, laity as well. Because this extraordinary synod was also extraordinary in the fact that it was on the family, and every day began with an address to the synodal fathers by a married couple from different parts of the world. And these addresses, thank God, were published, and they were very moving and very honest, describing the situation, but giving hope as well, but also raising questions that have to be addressed. And then, of course, there was a document issued that I've seen no reference to anywhere, a very beautiful document. It is a message from the Synodal Fathers to families. And it has a wonderful tone to it, I think, much better than the formal report, which is the work of not only one committee, but about 10 committees, and then another committee to summarize what the 10 committees had already discussed. But this message to families is something I think any group who's going to discuss the Synod, as they will be expected to, should start with. It becomes poetic at times. If I have time, I might read one or two sections of it that appeal to me at least. Yeah. Last week was quite incredible. Because I'm retired or semi-retired, I'm able to keep a bit of an eye on things, and people send me blogs and articles, and I could hardly keep up with it. And then this report was coming out, and that report was coming out. And of course the media reports were coming out. And by the way, I've discovered there are two media at the moment. There's the mainline media, and there's the social media, the bloggers. And they've been incredible. Now, I get mostly the kind of media that would actually appeal to me, evidently, because people who send it are friends of mine. So it's only one side of the story. I don't know what the other bloggers are saying, but that was quite extraordinary. But anyhow, last week really I was back in the 60s again. I entered the seminary in 63 when the council started. And the excitement of the council, even though which was also in part created by the media, was felt everywhere. Not quite as we didn't have quite wall-to-wall coverage as we have today, but there was sufficient to absorb and to make it exciting. There were tensions, there was drama going on, and last week you had a kind of a mini council, even though it wasn't a synod, it was only a preparatory synod, it wasn't a council, it was a meeting of just one bishop from the various 190 episcopal conferences around the world. So it was, and then you had the drama of the interim report. And then the reaction to that in the synod, when there was a revolt, according to reports that I got at least, when various cardinals said that just doesn't stand. That's not a summary of what we were talking about. And then came, of course, the decision by whoever was organising the council, the synod, with the approval of the Pope, it would seem, to set up a separate drafting committee to take the result of the circuli minori, the small subcommittees, and to draft the final report. After the chairmen of these small subcommittees turned out to be mostly, by election, the people who were not, shall we say, subscribing to Casper's agenda for the sake of simplicity. And then came the final report. And the week of high drama ended with a kind of a sigh of relief. Schism, which seemed imminent, had been avoided. I'm quite serious. It was very, very tense. And because of the media, this was a synod like no other, because we had instant access to usually distorted, but nonetheless information, some of it right, some of it wrong. I would describe, I don't know, there are people old enough here to remember the old circuses where they used to have these hall of mirrors, these distorting mirrors. You looked at yourself, you saw yourself big or small or ugly. Well, you're ugly to start with. It doesn't matter. But in a sense, the media has this kind of effect. There's truth there. Very often it's distorted. But it did seem that schism was imminent. And this should not be surprising, because in a sense we have been living with a kind of a quiet schism for the past 40 years. Because there are unresolved tensions ever since the council, in fact, which have not been resolved. The reason I wanted to title this talk In Praise of Pope Francis is because he has taken the risk to open up that debate, to let the tensions come out. So his silence during those 2 weeks, when I'm sure he wanted to intervene, I think is enormous. Somebody described him, I think Archbishop Martin described him like a father with a very unruly family. Now, it is I talked about the distorted images of the Synod. Now, these fed into the public's expectations and fears. What were these expectations? Some people were hoping that the Church's teaching would change. Others were afraid, were expecting, on the other hand, that the Synod would come out with a reaffirmation of the Church's teaching, as though we didn't have that already. And they were disappointed. Others had fears that perhaps actually, and this is the most serious one, perhaps the Church might change its teaching on various basic issues regarding sexual morality and the family. Others feared it wouldn't change. So you had all these expectations, and the media fed into that. And the famous, of course, example of this is the way the final report was reported on Monday, or Sunday and Monday in particular, in the various media, including the Irish media, as though the Synod had been talking about nothing but same-sex marriage or homosexuality. There were two paragraphs. One of them was quite a watered-down version of a paragraph that appeared in the interim report. And that paragraph apparently only reflected one particular paper by a bishop. There were 260 different papers. The bishops submitted the result of their own local conferences to the organising committee, and that was fed in, and they just gave summaries of it in the discussion. But according to the press secretary Lombardi, Father Lombardi, only one actually mentioned the topic of homosexuality. Not that that matters. Also, the actual watered-down version was rejected by, it didn't get the two-thirds majority. It got a good number of votes. Because it is an issue that has to be addressed. And that is something that even only one person says it doesn't matter. In the church, very often, it's not what the crowd is saying, but it's what the little boy who sees the emperor has no clothes stands up and says something. Yeah? The media, for example, just this example of the stress on the same-sex marriage and all the rest of it, what the media ignored was the following paragraph, which was approved by an overwhelming majority, and it too rejected, in effect, the attempt to intimidate church pastors with regard to this question. It's referring to the way priests or Lutheran pastors or anyone, if they want to speak about the church's teaching on this issue in public, they can be, in some countries, put into jail, fined at least. They can lose their... In Sweden recently, I heard of a Lutheran pastor who dared to say what the church's teaching is, or the tradition is, and he was dismissed by the bishop from his post. Yeah. So the Synod Fathers objected to that, that pastors must have the freedom to speak what the church's teaching is. Later on, of course, it modified that by saying they also must be careful what language they use. Yeah. We'll come back to that because in many ways the whole synod was about language. And then it went on to say, it took, and this is very important, this came from the African bishops in particular. They objected to the international organizations like the EU, the UNO, the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. They didn't mention these, but these evidently are implied, because they objected to these organizations who link aid to poor countries with legislation for so-called marriage of people of the same sex. It's almost a quotation. Yeah? that was ignored. Because there is an agenda going on here at the moment, of course, leading up to a referendum. And so, unfortunately, our papers are no longer objective papers reporting the truth, but they are engaged in a program, in a political program. They have, in a real sense, an agenda. They believe it's right, of course. It's a moral agenda. They are morally, and that we shouldn't deny the goodwill of people who actually are pushing an agenda. They really think, and right, and that actually this is something good which has to be done. So we must be very careful when we get upset about the media. All too often the church has done the similar thing. Yeah? Objective truth has not always been the mark of the church's media or coverage. And so you had these expectations, these fears, and the media fed into that. Not only the secular media, but also the Catholic media and the social media. And some of the things that were said were quite horrendous. Also by the social media, sympathetic to the traditional church situation, if you wish. Yeah? And this fueled, I think, the initial confusion caused by the way the first week of the Synod was manipulated, as far as I'm concerned, by those who were convinced that they were acting according to the mind of Pope Francis. There's probably a truth to that, by the way, to a certain extent. Yeah, we'll come back to that, because we're dealing with a Pope that is also subject to a media persona. He is a much more complex man, I think, and and we have to be very careful about this. Inside the Synod, I gather from other sources, things were quite different. The bishops themselves, Cardinal Vincent Nichols of Westminster said, the atmosphere within the Synod Hall, despite the tensions, despite the actual, close discussion, was relaxed. Yeah? Again, because all the bishops, whatever their positions, they realized we all think we want the good, we want to do the right thing, and we're passionate about it, which I think is wonderful. And therefore, and by the way, you can only have a good argument, in my opinion, with a friend where there's a basic agreement there. And on all sides, and all that I've read, there is a basic agreement about what the church's teaching is. It was never questioned. The application of it, which some people probably rightly think would have implications that might put into question some of the church's teaching. That is I don't deny that. But you can't have a good argument, you can't have a good discussion unless there's a basic a basic agreement about basic things, and no one questioned. The trouble is, especially the social media, especially the blogs, etc., they were questioning it. The people who were actually so much on the side of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. The Pope himself summed up the situation, I think, in his closing address very well. He said rightly, it was a real exercise in collegiality, and frankness was the mark of the Synod. He used the Greek word parrhesia, Paul uses it, that the man of conscience, the man who's actually standing up for the truth, he has to have that freedom to express. He has that freedom. He expresses himself freely because he believes he's standing on the rock of truth. He might know the truth. He may be mistaken. He's open to be corrected, but he is frank. Now, very often these synods, this, by the way, type of synod is quite a novum, something new in the church, created by Blessed Paul VI at the end of the Second Vatican Council, to really break down the centrality of the church, to let the Pope hear what's happening around the world, get representatives of the different bishops' conferences around the world to come to Rome once every 4 years or something, and let's listen to them. They had not become that. Because bishops being bishops, they're human beings. We're all looking after our careers. Yeah? Sorry, but it's true. And we must also reckon with the humanity of the church. Yeah? And they weren't going to get any advance if they began criticizing the Pope. So Pope Francis, at the only words he said were at the beginning, at the end. At the very beginning, he said, somebody said to me, wrote to me saying that bishops would be afraid to voice their opinion in your presence. And that would have been true. I think falsely, in the presence of their predecessors. Yeah? Falsely because as a student of Ratzinger's, I know what he always loved was a free discussion. Yeah? That's why he was a wonderful teacher, and that's why he was a wonderful man to meet at any time and any kind of a forum or discussion. He wanted just frank discussion. But if you're if you're kind of in awe of the Pope, and we'll come back to that as another issue, then of course you won't. So he asked the bishops and the cardinals, be honest, be frank. Don't think you're going to offend me. Now, he refers to the ups and downs, the tensions and excitement of a sometimes very heated debates between committed pastors, coming from different perspectives, some very radically different. I would call it a battle of the titans. Yeah? These are big men. These are really extraordinary, competent men with huge experience behind them, huge theological credits to their name, etc., etc. Yeah? Now, some of this drama leaked out and made the headlines. And then the final report came as a surprise because of the unanimity that was there. And even those who voted no vote actually, even a yes vote, a no vote can mean I don't approve of it because I don't like what's in it or because it doesn't say enough. And good that the no vote, that text will remain in the discussion document that goes back now to the local churches, including the Church in Ireland, I hope. Though we're not very good at that kind of discussion, yeah? As I said, it's not actually a literary masterpiece, but it is very, very worthwhile as an agenda for a meeting. As I said, and it's rooted in good theology as far as I can see. It's sensitive to the myriad problems that beset marriage, the family, children, and single people today. Now, no one can say, reading this document, I think, the church is out of touch. Now, what I want to stress here, because of the build-up to the excitement around the synod, was that he concluded his address by quoting his immediate predecessor extensively. Now, Benedict XVI once wrote that the supreme rule of conduct for all ministers of God, Pope, Bishop, priests, is an unconditional love, like that of the Good Shepherd, full of joy, given to all, attentive to those close to us, solicitous for those who are distant, gentle towards the weakest, the little ones, the simple, the sinners, to manifest the infinite mercy of God with the reassuring words of hope, quoting St. Augustine. In his own words, Pope Francis said, the Pope is not the supreme Lord, but rather the supreme servant of the servants of God, the guarantor of the obedience and conformity of the Church to the will of God, to the gospel of Christ, and to the tradition of the Church, putting aside every personal whim, despite being, by the will of Christ himself, the supreme pastor and teacher of all the faithful, and despite, quoting canon law, despite enjoying supreme, immediate, full, and universal ordinary power in the Church. And then he added a most telling sentence of all, And this should never have been seen as a source of confusion and discord. Now, actually, I read this text again and I discovered that that sentence appears in a different context in the second text. But essentially he's saying the very same thing. This should not have been a sense of confusion and discord. And why was it? Well, I'll give you my own spin on the thing. Yeah? The well-meaning campaign by Cardinal Walter Casper, backed by, most certainly not all, German and Italian bishops, to promote his own novel proposal to grant some remarried divorcees admission to the sacrament, was, to my mind, the cause of that confusion and discord. And the Pope was partially responsible for that. He invited him to address the cardinals last February to begin the process, and he praised the talk that Casper gave. Now, I read the talk afterwards, wrote an article on it, and what did he praise? 2/3 of that article is quite a good theology of marriage. Beautiful in many ways. And 1/3 is devoted to casuistry. 2 cases. Now, casuistry was precisely, can come back to that, the type of moral theology that the council rejected. Yeah? It was the type of moral theology that actually formed most clerics, bishops and priests before the council and even after the council to a certain extent. Yeah? Casuistry is hard cases. They make very bad law. And the Pope himself, I think, realizes that, and towards the end, before the Synod started, he set up a special commission to look at it. It's a topic that should really not perhaps have been on the agenda. Perhaps, I don't know. Sometimes you need a topic like that, or the other topic I mentioned, same-sex relations, in order actually to get to the core of an issue. That campaign, of course, which is very much a Western European campaign, above all in Germany. It had almost the full support of the German bishops, not quite all. There were a number who objected. But Germany is one of the richest churches, is keeping the rest of the church, in Africa and Asia in particular, and Latin America going, yeah? Because it's state-funded effectively through the tax. I think they brought in something like 91 million this year. But it's a church that is dying. And it's a church where, many people are leaving the church. Yeah? And of course, it's a church that, in actual fact, is quite, as Benedict himself said, worldly. And in his Benedict's official state visit to Germany, he finished up in Fribourg, in Bresgau, and he called the church to become less worldly, not to have these big palaces, not to have all this money. Yeah? And of course, the answer is, and all the liberals agree, if you want to use that term, but look at the good it's doing. Look at all the people it's supporting in Africa, which it is. When the African churches rose and said, that we object to various aspects, what did Cardinal Casper do? He said, well, who are they to tell us? Yeah? A terrible mistake. Terrible. I think Joe Carroll referred to it as shooting oneself in both feet. Yeah? And I'm sorry, because I met Casper, I don't know him all that well. I think he's a superb theologian in many ways. Don't disagree with all he writes, but that's what theology is. You don't always disagree. I do believe he's absolutely passionate, and I have enough contact with the Germans, or German people, couples, etc., who are in this awful position, and who want to go to communion, but they're separated and remarried, etc. So it's a real problem. We shouldn't deny that. Yeah? And I think he was caught off guard, and he shouldn't have said what he did, unfortunately. Yeah? Now, the campaign that he started, that's my main point, and the media coverage it received was taken up, especially in Europe and in America, straight away. by the so-called progressive Catholics. This caused acute distress to others, like myself, who at no personal cost tried to remain true to the magisterium. Some people who've been trying to defend the Church's teaching in various ways in their lives and otherwise say they feel they are the ones who are marginalized in the Church. And one priest confided to me that his faith had been severely tested over the past 12 months, and he was not alone. If I might just comment on that, and I think that is something actually not negative, it's positive. Yeah? I hope to come back to that. Yeah? Our faith is being tested, and it should be tested. As I said, there must be some truth in Cardinal Casper's assertion that actually the Holy Father, he was articulating what the Holy Father would have wanted. And I think it's found in our Holy Father's intense desire to embrace the sinner as Christ did. His whole pontificate manifests that love. It is the love of the anxious father waiting for the prodigal son to return to his loving embrace. Many who went astray and who for years felt lost and abandoned by the Church, and many outside the Church who falsely but understandably perceive her teaching, her moral teaching as rigorous, have indeed come back to receive forgiveness and absolution in confession. That is the positive effect of what Pope Francis is achieving by his humanity. As a doctor said to me, a consultant said to me one time, whom I didn't think he was interested, he said, he really is, to me, showing the face of Christ. In the final report, yes, there was a lot of criticism that said the people who felt they're marginalized, who felt their faith was being tested, was because the whole discussion up to then, and even in the Synod up to the interim report, if you just followed it fell from Mars and came down, there was no mention. You would imagine there was nothing happening before Francis. There was no magisterium of John Paul II, no extraordinary teaching, his books and his writings, etc. Nothing about Benedict XVI, as if they were obliterated, never existed. Yeah. But in the final report, they are quoted extensively, as far as I can see. But the real man, of course, whose voice was being ignored, was that of Pope Paul VI, his encyclical Humanae Vitae. And I think that is at the core of the whole issue. Because Humanae Vitae 46 years ago, that actually effectively created a schism in the Church. Not an open schism, but an effective one. Yeah. And the two sides over the 40 years began to become more and more entrenched, I would put it. Yeah. Those who were defending Humanae Vitae and the tradition of the Church, including John Paul II and Benedict, and trying to explain it, to develop it, not just hold on to it. There's been an extraordinary body of teaching of John Paul II's, for example, on the theology of the body, recognizing the significance of the body, the whole question of human love, human sexuality, etc., etc. These are topics that were treated by Pope John Paul II, one of the most extraordinary minds to have been Pope, and to a lesser extent Benedict XVI, especially his encyclical God is Love, where even people who would have been on the called the liberal side, to use a political term, they recognized this man knows what he's talking about when he talks about natural love and God's love, which is what it's all about. However, it can't be denied that those who feel marginalized in the church, who are trying to defend the church, if you're pushed into a corner, you can become extreme in your own way. And I think that the Pope Francis is aware of the tendency to self-righteousness and rigorism in those who, at times all too vociferously, defend the Church's highly contentious moral teaching. And I think he uses every opportunity to exercise what I would call correctio fraterna. Within the religious life, is what those in religious life are supposed to do with each other: correct your faults. And this he did also in the concluding address to the Synod. And in that concluding address, if I might just, he talks about the different temptations we have. And the word temptation is very significant. Sorry for this now. Yeah. He said, one temptation is a temptation to hostile inflexibility. That is, wanting to close oneself within the written word, the letter of the law, in other words, that Paul condemned. Not allowing oneself to be surprised by God, the God of surprises. The Spirit within the law. Very bad translation. With the certitude of what we know and not of what we need to learn and to achieve. You know, this is a very bad translation because the official translation hasn't come out yet. In other words, he's talking about those who are too certain of the truth. And if truth isn't accompanied, Paul says you must speak the truth in love. You know? And the precondition is a bit of humility. You know? We don't have the truth. As Benedict said, or Ratzinger often said, we can be possessed by the truth. Truth can grab us, but we don't have it. And we're always searching for it. From the time of Christ, he said, it's the temptation of the zealous, the scrupulous, of the solicitors, and the so-called today traditionalists, also of the intellectuals. Perhaps I might qualify there. Good to hear that. Sometimes I think, while reading Evangelii Gaudium, I think I listen to the voice of a retreat master, the Jesuit retreat master. On the other hand, he said there's the temptation to do-goodism in the name of a deceptive mercy that binds the wounds without first curing them and treating them, that treats the symptoms and not the causes and the roots. It is a temptation of the do-gooders, of the fearful, and also of the so-called progressives and liberals, inverted commas, like the traditionalists. Yeah? And then he goes on, he said, there is a temptation to transform stones into bread for the long, heavy, and painful fast. He's referring here to the devil's temptation of Jesus after the fast. Turn stones into bread. And also to transform the bread into a stone and cast it against sinners. The weak and the sick, referring to the woman caught in adultery. And so to transform it into unbearable burdens. Yeah? Luke 11:46, I didn't check that. And then he really is addressing priests and bishops and anyone who's teaching, even John here. It's the temptation to come down off the cross, to please the people, and not to stay there, in order to fulfill the will of the Father, to bow down to a worldly spirit instead of purifying it and bending it to the Spirit of God. Now, we priests, we're also human. Yeah? It isn't easy, unless you're an Egypt like myself. to stand up. Well, I go into the media, they can't do much harm there, but stand up in a pulpit occasionally with people you know and try to speak the truth. It's very hard. Much easier to come down off the cross and say, look, okay, get on with it, lads. You know, okay, yeah, you're all right now. God's love. God is love, yeah. It continues, this is part of the temptation to neglect the depositum fidei, the deposit of faith, of not thinking themselves as guardians, but as owners or masters of it. In other words, that they could change it. And on the other hand, the temptation to neglect reality, this is the traditionalists, making use of meticulous language and a language of soothing, to say so many things and to say nothing. They called it Byzantinism, etc., etc. So the Pope knows exactly what's happening. And I had to ask myself, and I had the fortune to be up in Donegal for the weekend doing supply work in a little parish up there, right up in Fanad, northwest Donegal, wonderful place, to think about these things. Yeah? What was it all about? What was the Synod all about? Yeah? And what was the Pope trying to do? Now, we've had several extraordinary popes in the last century, 2 saints and 1 blessed among them. But we also had we were spoiled with two extraordinary minds. Yeah? A wonderful philosopher and a wonderful theologian, John Paul II and Benedict. They are the exception. Yeah? We expect too much of the papacy. They are the exception. I was trying to go back in history. You had learned popes in canon law and all the rest of it, which is also very important. Quite well above, yeah. And but these 2 men, thank you, Chairman. Yeah. These 2 men were exceptional. So I'll finish with that. I think with this line, the Petrine mission of the present Holy Father, I think, could be summed up in Jesus' high prayer that all may be one. And that is the whole purpose of the process of this unique Synod of Bishops that began February last week and is continuing now, is beginning of the reception, will continue in the local church until the final Synod. And this unique Synod is involving everybody, thanks paradoxically to the media. Now the whole church is involved in a way that can be dramatic and risky, but it is a risk, I think, worth taking. Thank you.